Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched, where this week, in accordance with the time of year, I watched The Return of the Living Dead from 1985. Now, way back, some years ago now, fairly early on in this series, I think, I watched Dawn of the Dead. And I actually don't remember at this point whether I even talked about Night of the Living Dead before it. But what's interesting, one of the things that's interesting about this movie is that it is the product of a schism. Well, schism might be too forceful. It is the split between John Russo and George A. Romero after they made Night of the Living Dead. That being all the way back in 1968. So after that movie, they both had different ideas, well known within sort of the horror sphere. They had different ideas for how they wanted the sequel to go, and so they split off and went their separate ways. Romero would then make the Of the Dead series, Dawn of the Dead first, I believe. It was Dawn of the Dead, then Day of the Dead, then anyway. And then Russo would work on the Living Dead series. My understanding is he retained the rights to the title Living Dead. And so this ended up with two sort of separate camps about what zombies are like, what they do, the tones of things. And I found out after watching this film some of the background behind it and why it is the way it is. And it's actually kind of interesting because not a lot of it apparently is because of Russo. It's because, primarily it seems, because of the director here, Dan O'Bannon, who, this is his directorial debut, though he had previous credits on other things in the horror genre, and he was a writer before this. Another interesting part of that is that, well, this movie it's a cult classic. It's probably most known, at least in pop culture, for probably one of two things. Either the really excellent puppeteering and effects work done by Alan Troutman, who plays I think they call it the tar zombie in this movie, basically the first zombie. And the other thing that this movie is known for is Linnea Quigley, I think that's her name, who spends most of the entire film completely naked. And primarily she's known for, like, within the first 10, 15 minutes of the film, doing a naked dance on top of a grave. Those are the two things this movie is maybe most known for. But that kind of gets away from what's more interesting about this film. Well, put a pin in that. The point I was bringing that up for is, what's funny about that is, same year, another movie would come out by the name of Life Force. And Life Force is a movie that is known as the one with Patrick Stewart where there is a naked there is a vampire from outer space who is naked the entire movie. The horror genre is very weird, and I kind of buried the lead there. Life Force was written or co-written by Dan O'Bannon, the director of this movie. So it all ties back together. It's one big happy family in the horror genre. And there's a lot of weird stuff that goes on in movie production, especially when it comes to like low budget movies, although there's lots of different kinds of weird stuff that goes in high budget movies. Anyway, I digress. This is a movie I really only know about because of its cult status. I've been told before, oh, this is like the comedic one. This is sort of a different take on zombies. And, I didn't quite understand the full extent to which this was going to be quite so different. I fully understood that this was more on the comedic side. This is basically a full comedy for all intents and purposes. Like, it's not trying to be quippy and funny super hard the entire time or anything like that. It's not going to I guess I shouldn't call it full comedy in that regard. It's definitely still a horror movie, but at no point does this movie take itself seriously. It's very goofy. Everything from the overacting of all the actors, the background elements, little nods to certain things, either in the horror genre or that sort of thing, scenery and outfits that are like telling about the characters that are on screen. The guy who runs the mortuary in particular, there's some subtext in his music choices and some of the things around the place that are kind of interesting if you catch them. They're weird choice, honestly, but it just adds, there's so many little things like that add flavor to this movie, and make it very, very clear that the thing is supposed to be over the top, ridiculous, not taken seriously, and you're not really supposed to respect anybody on screen at any point for any reason. This is very much in contrast to something like Day of the Dead, which is taking itself rather seriously. It's a commentary, it's a social commentary of various layers, as I talked about in that video. You should go back and watch it if you hadn't. And this is such a stark contrast where it's not really making a social commentary. It's very much using zombies as a just a monster, a monster to be a catalyst for events to happen, right? It is genre defining in certain respects. I understand this may be the first movie that suggests that zombies only want brains. I'm not sure if that's accurate or not. This seems awfully late for that to be true, but that's what I was reading. And there's a few little like zombie details that then end up you see transferred much later into the zombie genre. There's also a lot of things that I have seen that the zombies in here do that I don't think I've seen them do in any other piece of zombie media. And I do wonder if that's because they are a little bit too silly and a little bit too subversive of, if you wanted to use zombies as a social commentary of sorts, letting these elements stay would be kind of contrary to that. So minor spoilers here if you don't want information, but frankly, there's not a lot to spoil in this movie. You're just kind of watching scenes play out and enjoying the ride. So the zombies can talk, they can speak in English, they can make complex plans and set traps. They're basically, for all intents and purposes, full-fledged humans. They're just dead and with different motivations, let's say. And I think that's a lot of fun because it lends itself to a different kind of horror and a different kind of monster. It's still, at its core about a consumption thing, a rage and anger and pain and all these other things that are typically sort of kind of associated with zombies as a massive horde, but they're taken in a very different way, and especially when characters are turned to zombies, that results in a very different kind of expectation. In a lot of zombie media, when a person turns zombie, they're just dead, and maybe that's played for some element of despair, as the remaining survivors have to see somebody they knew reanimated, or even like have to do something to dispatch their old friend, despite the fact that it's the body of their old friend. This takes a very different kind of view of that and plays around with it in fun ways. This is not a particularly complex narrative, like I said. You basically know the whole thing at the start. It's just zombies happen, and then the survivors run around trying not to get killed. And that's about it. And so it is a little bit dependent on character building. I would say that most of the characters in here are not heavily tropified, because that it gives sort of the impression that you know all the things already, but they're very simple in their portrayal. Every character sort of has one clear emotion that drives them, one clear objective that drives them. Sort of you get very quickly who's going to behave in what way in any given scenario. And so then it's just sort of mashing up various combinations of characters to see how they behave and whether they survive what the next thing that's about to come their way. And like I said, because the characters are not supposed to be taken particularly seriously, they're behaving in sometimes silly ways, sometimes just normal human irrational types of ways. There's enough complexity there to continue driving, watching them survive. But rather than a lot of zombie media where it's like, oh, the zombies are completely evil, they only want to kill the survivors, and you're attached to the survivors and you want them to survive. This takes a very different angle that's a little bit more classic horror, or campy horror, the kind of thing that I would almost imagine being more in my mind's eye, it's the kind of thing you go to a drive-in theater to watch with friends and snacks and all that. It's taking itself so unseriously that you're just as much rooting for the zombies in a way as you are the survivors, because you're just kind of watching them do stuff back and forth to each other. This isn't slasher horror where there's some unknowable evil. The evil is very known, but it is also very single-minded in the same way sort of slasher stuff is done. And so a lot of it comes down to the presentation. I really, really like the production of this film. It's clearly very low budget, but they do extraordinary work with a very limited budget. Most of the cast is fairly not big names by any means. I mean, this is the 80s, making horror movies in the 80s. It's not a big profitable business. But some of these people were people who were in and around horror at the time, and some of them, this was sort of their first gig, where they'd show up in a bunch of more horror films after. And I think they all do totally serviceable jobs. Like I said, they're very kind of over the top. They're very simple characters. They are, and they're chewing on the scenery. They're acting beyond what is necessary. A lot of this movie is very theatrical in its presentation. While it's not necessarily doing stage work per se in that same exact sort of way, a lot of the movement around the scenery, a lot of the gesticulation, a lot of the facing and framing and all that feels theatrical. It feels in that way over the top, like you're playing to the back. And I really appreciate that for something that is trying to be a little bit more cheesy with itself. So that I think all of the actors work really well together. You don't need a complex story. You kind of understand the base level of their relationships between each other. There's no need for exposition. Everybody just sort of talks to each other like they know each other, because they do. There's no more complexity needed. And so this movie is really it excels at telling a story with the most limited amount of presentation necessary. It doesn't need to explain the entire background behind why zombies exist. And in fact, it leans into the fact that the story behind it doesn't make any sense. I kind of love the idea that they set up at the beginning that Night of the Living Dead was a fiction piece, but they set up that, oh, but the army did it for real, but in a weird way that isn't accurate to the movie. And so now and that's all you need. That's the setup for this movie. And now the rest, you just roll with it. Nobody's asking special questions about super science. There's no lab scenes or any of the stuff that happens in a lot of zombie media. It's just happening. And then the whole narrative, I certainly won't spoil this, but the ending is such a beautiful capping of the whole scenario. It's both completely anticipatable as you watch, and yet such a fun surprise the way everything ends up working out. It's just a ton of fun. Like I said, low budget, and they're keeping everything very limited in scope. It's like 3 buildings, 1 street, and a basement. And they don't need to make it any more complex than that. But the things they spend the money on are the things that really matter. The set dressing for these couple of locations, the costumes for the various characters, a few vehicles that are, telling in their own right because of the era that they're from, the way these characters dress, their makeup, their, all of their little accessories and things like that. And then really, really great makeup and practical effects work. I don't know how much money that cost them all, but that feels like where all of the detail work in, and that is exactly the right choice, because nothing else in the movie really needed that much money thrown at it as far as true expense, not just more than just sort of running the operation. So finessing all the makeup so that the zombies look great, so that you have these various pieces of animatronics that the actors can work with, when you're playing with a lot of gore and dismemberment and stuff like that, but you're not doing it in the super grotesque way. It's ultimately kind of silly. Then being able to have just a really well-made animatronic hand that flops around on its own looks great. And then there's the Tar Man, who is one of the best costume puppets that I've ever seen. I love that thing. I stopped it and rewound it several times just to watch each of the bits with that in it, because it looks fantastic. It's it's the best looking zombie I've ever seen, pretty much. And I think this was before Troutman even worked at Muppet Studios. So he would go on to have, he already had a career in doing this stuff, and then would go on to have an even more prolific career doing puppetry after. So it's just really, really well done. They spend the money where it matters. They all the set dressing, all the little details are just perfectly set up. And one of the things that I think has a weird charm to it, that I don't know if it was a result of budgetary constraints or what, there's a lot of really long shots in this film. Usually that's the kind of thing that directors do for prestige, but I love when I see it, because it usually means one of two things. Either it's being done for prestige, like a huge Hollywood blockbuster type of thing. We've talked about Warners before, where they're showing how impressively they can set up a set, and how well their actors can do that. They can take a long shot with no cuts, with everybody executing everything perfectly, and there's a prestige to that. But there's also the cheapness to that, and I think it's deliberate. I don't even think it was necessarily a limitation. I think they may have done it on purpose as a stylistic thing. There's a very cheap feeling to that if you watch enough horror and low budget films in general, where rather than take a lot of shots with a lot of camera angles and things like that, whether it's single camera or multi-camera setups, they're just like, we got the one camera, it's in this room, do the scene. And you just get a oneer as a result. And it's not done cheaply either. Like one of the opening scenes is this real long piece, and it's not like it's a crazy presentation, a crazy shot or anything. They're just like, okay, we're gonna walk around this place. I'm gonna do a bunch of things. The camera's gonna do all sorts of movement all around to follow what we're doing here, and it's executed perfectly. I love it. I don't know what the intention, or if there was intention behind it, or they were just like, this is just the easiest way to do it, we'll run with it. But I just, shots like that, you don't see that much in the first place, and especially not in well produced but still inexpensive films. Overall, this movie's not complex. It's not wowing me in any respect. Well, it's not wowing me in a cinematic way, but it's got tons and tons of charm, and it comes from sort of an era of film that doesn't feel like it exists anymore. It's not that we don't have horror anymore, or we don't have comedy horror, but this, like I was saying before, has that feeling, a special sort of lost feeling to me of the kind of thing that is just grotesque enough, just horrific enough to be a little bit unnerving, but is framing that in comedy so frequently that, like, it's the perfect movie to sit around with a bunch of people and laugh and eat snacks and jeer at, and without delving into the part of being like cheap and bad, or cheap so bad it's good. It's genuinely just good throughout, even if it's just not trying to do a whole lot. It's fun. It's just fun. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched, and I'll see you guys next time.